There is a concern regarding the degree whereby the involvement of peoples within a society leads towards innovations of goods and services. These kinds of concerns surround the notion that people require some motivation to do the relevant labor. What are the metrics of involvation of the laborers towards the aim of innovation? In the current system, the basic theory and practice for the metrics of involvation is money, greed, the accumulation of wealth. The notion more or less is that people are motivated to involvement within the labor force as a matter of, on the one hand, work to live, as in, forced into the labor force as a matter of life and death, and on the other hand, given the potential boon of wealth, access to privileges, etc., predicated at least in theory upon the degree of hard work and innovative capacity. I don't deny that such works, however, there are better methodologies, and there are fairly horrific consequences embedded within the current system. The notion of involvement as a matter of force, that is, again, work or die mentality, is dubious on a number of levels. Perhaps relevant to the sort of persons who are likely to find disagreement with the Moneyless Free Labor Society, such as a massive reduction of freedom and liberty of the people. In other words, having one's labor be effectively forced into the servitude of another via the metrics of money is so egregious, a violation of the notion of freedom and liberty, it is somewhat difficult to understand why it is that such folks would really hold to it so dearly. Oft these are the same people who decry, not wrongly, the absolute horrors such a system creates. Such things as the degradation of the familial form, loss of family values, lack of freedom of choice in work, impositions on liberties to live one's own life, etc. Relevantly note that the folks who developed the system themselves decried the problems associated with exactly the realities of wage labor. Perhaps that deserves a bit of furtherance to the point. The folks who developed capitalism understood that there was embedded within it an issue with wage labor. It is all fine and dandy to be an entrepreneur, to own one's own land and be an independent farmer. When such is done through the mechanism of others' labors, however, even if it is paid labor, it creates pretty significant issues with the underpinning values of the system. Folks ought understand this piece as at least in part a response to those kinds of concerns. I'd suggest to such readers that they seriously consider the merits of the Moneyless Free Labor Society proposal here as it relates to the pragmatics of life, the freedoms and liberties thereof. Still, as I said, the current system does promote innovation. It also promotes scams, thievery, dehumanization of peoples, breakdowns of community, breakdowns of familial form, etc. After all, the current system doesn't really differentiate innovations as good or bad, beyond the capacity of someone to sell it. Scamming one's way towards wealth is so exceedingly common that it comprises a massive part of the current labor force, hence, after all the surplus labor in the current. The question within the Moneyless Free Labor Society, though, is what metrics are utilized to motivate people towards innovation. Primary, secondary, and principled motivations. In a very meaningful sense, this is a kind of nonsensical question. People work for a wide variety of reasons. As noted elsewhere in this piece, people work for their families in a primary sense, and for the communities they live in secondarily. The motivation to do so is pretty straightforward, given within the limits of the hands of labor. Specifically, the motivation to work smarter, not harder, to provide the means to reduce the overall workload by innovative solutions to problems. The motivation to do high-quality work, if for no other reason than so that you don't have to go out and do it again later. Consider the plumber or the electrician, the tradesfolks. They are tasked with some repair work somewhere. It is their job. They know if they do a poor job, they're going to have to go out and do it again. In a moneyed system, wherein their pay is a matter of how many hours they work, there is an incentive to exactly do a poor job, or a just good enough job. That way they can get more work, get more money, get more wealth, get more privileges, etc. Likewise, they are incentivized to pretend to do work that isn't required, and in general to do subpar labor. In a moneyless system, the motivation is exactly to find a way wherein they don't have to keep doing that labor. The simplest solution, of course, is to just do a good job the first time. More complex solutions may entail things like innovating ways whereby the actual work done is less. That is, to develop better methods of plumbing or electrical systems whereby the requirement for maintenance is less. Hence the motivation to innovate as a matter of course, but also the motivation to produce high-quality goods and services in the first place. There is a kind of scam option available to the laborer. Can't someone else do it? The notion therein being that it is possible for the laborer to avoid working. However, this kind of problem is wildly overblown. See points regarding the limits of the freeloader. A bit more obliquely, see also the points regarding educating people regarding their duties, the realities of the Moneyless Free Labor Society, and the benefits relative to other systems. In broad strokes, free access to all the goods and services primarily within a bioregion, secondarily within adjacent bioregions, and tertiarily within non-adjacent bioregions is a pretty good thing in terms of material access to goods and services, and hence insofar as those kinds of rewards are motivational, a moneyless free labor society provides a good reward to motivate people. Other metrics of involvation of the laborer include such things as prestige, being highly thought of within a community, being thought highly of within their family, pragmatics from the hands of labor, as in, by working hard, working smarter, etc., one is actually helping to create and produce the goods and services one is consuming. Intellectual development. In terms of intellectual development, I mean, famously intellectuals tend to give almost zero shits about money. Few are the intellectuals who do what they do because of money. Little doubt the intellectuals can be enticed or be pragmatic about exactly what aspects they focus on via money, but it isn't really at all what the intellectual is primarily motivated by. To be clear therein, it is not generally speaking the big core that innovate, it is the intellectual laborers they have within their ranks that do the overwhelming majority of the relevant innovative labor. The big corp at best provides the means and venue for the intellectuals to work, the organizational structures, the methodologies of distribution, etc., and that isn't nothing. Most intellectuals wouldn't have a clue if asked to somehow also distribute their products, or somehow procure all the various operati they may need for their labor. But, regarding the question of innovation as such, the actual metrics of involvation in the labors of innovation, to the intellectuals money just isn't a thing. Will work for doof is a reality for the intellectuals. Free labor in the current. It is well worth considering the degree whereby free labor already exists within the current. Here it is important to note the free labor associated with reproductive labors, having and raising babies, housework, maintenance of the home, building social structures, volunteer labor, etc. but also all the various free software, open source products, and a large number of other kinds of products and services within the system. YouTube, Facebook, various social media, a huge variety of games, be they video games or tabletop games, music, entertainment, educational tools, etc. The massive flood of free products and services in the current already proves the validity of the claim that people will actually work for free, and they will also produce high-quality products and services by doing so. If we remove the incentives to scam, to advert in order to survive, the number of additional products and services that would become free would further skyrocket. In the Moneyless Free Labor Society, that which works is paramount, that which people want and desire is somewhat secondary, but of the latter those kinds of wants and desires become much of the metrics of success. In other words, when one is literally giving away their goods and services, the bar is so low the main metric of concern is if anyone is even interested in consuming the product or utilizing the service at all. The concerns of quality therein are real. To some meaningful extent this, however, has already been proven to be plausibly obtained. Though folks may quibble over the details, the various free software, educational tools, entertainments, etc., that are freely produced are generally of high quality. They have already developed a variety of methods for quality control. Quality control will be expanded upon a bit later in this section. Moreover, absent the incentives to scam, steal, etc., many of the issues associated with quality control are thereby dealt with. Meritocracy revisited. There remain issues regarding skill, technique, etc. However, these are largely educational problems. Little doubt that we want people competent in their labor actually doing the labor. There are a number of different aspects to these kinds of concerns. In terms of education, understanding that such would be freely available, and indeed, such is already freely available via the internets. Having some methodologies in place to ensure that a laborer in a given occupation actually knows what they are doing is valuable. Within all the pragmatic fields of concern, much of this is realistically taught on the worksite, as in apprenticeships. Trade schools may be valuable in the sense of priming laborers and giving laborers a sense of what the job actually may entail. But in the pragmatics of learning, by far the best methodology is to actually do the work as an apprentice. Requiring the trade schools is largely superfluous for the vast majority of labor. Merit in this sense is something determined on the job, with people who are incompetent essentially being remanded to other labor, either within the field of concern or to some other field. Trade schools likely remain useful more as a method of trying things out, rather than as a certification/degreeing tool, or a requirement tool. There is value, in other words, for individuals to have at their disposal what is, in essence, a kind of parody of the actual fields of work, and to try them out before committing to some specific job. Or, to retrain towards some other job if an individual decides to change their jobs. Universities and trade schools are given a fuller treatment later in this piece. Note that this implies a variety of paths for the laborer. Learning online about a trade is a thing. Practicing at home, perhaps via maintaining their home, doing construction there, repair work, etc., may prime the laborer for some particular related field of work. Trade schools likewise provide the laborer with the opportunity to study these things wherein they did not do so via online methods, or pragmatics in the home, etc. Such may entail the capacity to bypass the entry-level position within a given field. Such may also provide the capacity to start one's own business, rather than joining an existing one. However, the entry-level position is a legit path. All fields of labor have these. Moreover, having the capacity of on-the-job training to learn the various aspects of the trade is a thing. In a moneyless free labor society, the first and the latter are far more the norm. Absent any particular motive to make money, that is, to bypass the entry-level position, simply starting one's time doing labor is generally preferable. After all, from the laborer's perspective, understanding that they'll need to work for some number of years, better to just get it started and done with. Note that this implies that trade school, university, and perhaps schooling in general ought not be counted towards one's supposed duty towards the fulfillment of any labor obligations. Such is not necessarily the case. The incentives for doing it thusly being a bit dubious. Why bother going to school when I can just get my recs out the way? We may thereby lose out on a wide variety of highly skilled labor. The first becomes far more common as a byproduct of the system via the hands of labor. Work on the home by the people living there becomes far more common when the laborer is granted the time, means and motivation to do so. Time and means are granted fairly straightforwardly. Less labor required outside the home grants more time within the home to do those sorts of things. Moreover, the laborer is incentivized to do those sorts of labors as it means less labor overall in the market. The means are granted as they have free access to them within the relevant limits. The further motivation to do so largely comes from their homes being their own, that is, they are private property. Ownership is something of an odd way of phrasing it within a moneyless society. It is a bit more like as the occupants of the home, they have the rights to live there, improve the place, etc., and they have the right of refusal to let anyone else do so. Likewise, the various stuffs and thingy things within the home are not freely available for anyone to come by and take. Quality control. As noted elsewhere, if people don't partake in the product or service, it lacks merit. Hence there is a meritocracy involved in the moneyless free labor system. Moreover, also as noted elsewhere, there is a place for gatekeepers who in effect quality check the work. Quality controlling labor being something of the point of a meritocracy, and quality controlling being relevant to involvation of innovative structures as a means of determination as to what is innovative, what isn't, etc. This regardless of the kind of work we are speaking of. In many cases these gatekeepers are the people under whom the apprentice labors. They train, teach, and quality control the labor the apprentice is doing as a matter of course for the labor involved. In other cases quality control may look a lot like publications that have motives other than mass appeal. In other words, things that make sense via the relevant metrics for their fields. Here we may refer to various academic journals, peer review processes, etc. Such has its drawbacks, and there is a meaningful place for publicly reviewed pieces. See for instance the rather en masse produced intellectual materials online. Noting the relevant drawbacks of that, comforting ideas, information bubbles, bad ideas, etc. Having some sense of quality control therein is relevant. Such touches upon issues relating to free speech, and issues that may be delineated between the prestige afforded to various publication venues. Those kinds of things, however, may be beyond the scope of this piece, as they do not obviously or necessarily relate to a moneyless free labor society. They are occurring well within the confines of a moneyed society as it is. What is perhaps relevant to note therein being far more with the relative importance of having some methodology of quality control within any given venue. The absolute freeform flow of ideas is not necessarily entirely desirable within a public forum. Although it is noted elsewhere in this piece, as it relates directly to the concerns in this subsection, it's worth reiterating. The Moneyless Free Labor Society has no incentive to hang on to older, less efficient, more destructive techniques. In the current, perhaps of the utmost relevance on the point, in terms of energy production, the incentives of the fossil fuel industry to make money, and hence stomp out innovations in the field, have been fairly extreme. Be it from the perspective of Big Corp X, or from the perspective of the laborers thereof, the rationale is pretty much the same. They have to work to live, and hence the capacity to simply stop performing that kind of labor is extremely limited. In what ought to be a lesson for the ages, the notion of raw competition within a moneyed system leads not necessarily towards innovation, but towards stasis of form. The various rationales utilized to justify the fossil fuels position have degrees of validity to them, but in the bigger picture they're largely just foolishness. Work to live, jobs, etc., sure, but then, the Moneyless Free Labor Society doesn't actually have those kinds of concerns. This is a valid concern in the current, and is a major problem not just in the fossil fuel industry, but across the board in the society. They are in essence the issues surrounding surplus labor. It's just particularly devastating within the fossil fuel industry due to its polluting effects, climate change, etc. It is worthwhile to consider the various rationales given for the maintenance and importance of the fossil fuel industry, noting that such is applicable for all industries. That such motivational concerns are not unique to the fossil fuel industry, and such concerns stagnate the involvation of innovation exactly through the metrics of competition and moneyed concerns. We need fossil fuels. To some degree, yes. Perhaps more to the point though, we need oil and many of the various products that can be produced via oil, not just as fuels. The issues here are of course rather obvious. Other energy sources exist, better energy sources overall, energy sources that have far faster renewal rates, and fossil fuels are effectively a limited resource due to their slow rate of renewal. Burning through them on things we do not necessarily need, or indeed even want or desire, when there are alternatives available, is foolishness in the extreme. The position likewise fails on a basic logic level. If there are valid alternatives, we do not actually need fossil fuels as such. Far and away better to limit their use to within the renewal rates, and very likely far below them to avoid climate change, as well as all the rather crappy pollution that comes with their use. All of which lowers the quality of our lives. That said, the change to other sources does take time, does take a lot of effort. The point though is having an industry actively fight against that change is not innovation, it is stagnation. The Moneyless Free Labor Society does not suffer from this issue, and hence in terms of innovation, it performs better than a moneyed society. In sum, because of the extraneous motivations of a moneyed society to generate wealth and work to live, industries have incentives to do performative labor, create surplus labor, and hang on to labor that is no longer necessary, wanted or desirable. It generates wealth. So, in other words, it creates pretty seashells. If you believe this one, I've got a little story to sell you. In essence, this argument assumes that there is real value to money rather than money being just a tool. It mistakes pretend for reality. It's such a dumb argument it really ought to be laughed at. It creates jobs. This kind of argument is somewhat oddly not entirely unsound. It is nice to have a wide selection of jobs, activities to do, etc. It is a good thing to have available to people a wide variety of goods and services. However, as a rationale for why to not get rid of something when something better comes along, such becomes a problem. Likewise, the naked assumption that creating jobs is necessarily a good thing is flatly false. Performative labor, labor no one needs, wants, or desires, is not really a good thing. Boredom. Something to do with our hands and time. This particular metric of involvation towards innovation is seriously and serially overlooked. People enjoy doing things as a matter of life, living, etc. The notion that everyone would just sit around and literally do nothing is patently absurd. People often wonder at why so and so traveled to some far distant land, coming up with elaborate reasons for the journey. There must have been some reason, lack of resources available, desperation, etc., for such a person to make such a long and dangerous journey. Yet, the reality may be as simple as boredom, wanting adventure, wanting to do something. The limiting factors for utilizing that basic aspect of the human species are things like materials, techniques, skills, etc. In a moneyless free labor society, these kinds of things are maximally provided within the constraints of the renewal rates of the various resources. Insofar as we are concerned, therefore, with the issues of involvation towards innovation, the proposed model herein provides for far more capacity than the current one. Although this aspect has been touched upon earlier in this section, I want to try and address it rather directly. The various motivations via the hands of labor entail that different goods and services will be provided, but not necessarily less. It also entails that the labor people do will generally change, most notably with fewer work hours involved in the system outside the home. People will tend towards labors within the home, meaning fewer of those kinds of goods and services being provided outside the home, as the demand for them simply lessens. Hence, for sure we may lose such wonders as some fast food joints, demand for restaurants may lessen, demands for home repair specialists will lessen, etc. However, demand for supplies to do those kinds of things in the home will increase, demand for groceries, construction supplies, appliance parts, as opposed to appliances, will increase, etc. That said, we ought expect the demand for restaurants to continue. It is a wanted and desired aspect of life to taste the foods of others. It is nice to visit those kinds of places, and there are people who enjoy doing those kinds of labors. The impetus of the hands of labor to have someone else do it practically ensures that such things would persist. Some of the forms of such things may adapt. For instance, potlatches, community gatherings wherein people bring their foods to share, etc., may become a bit more the norm. But the essence of the restaurant remains, sharing one's foods with others. The main point regarding the relative loss of goods and services is that what goods and services are provided will shift, but they will shift more towards those goods and services people actually need, want, and desire. Again, absent the incentives to scam, steal, provide poor quality goods and services, etc., the overall structure clearly would shift. Likewise, the sheer amount of free time available to people once the surplus labor is removed will entail an increase in festivals, celebrations, faith-based work, volunteerism, good works, musical performances, arts and entertainment, hobbies, games and crafts, but then, these are not bad things. Moreover, we'd expect these kinds of goods and services to have a bioregional style to them, which would tend to increase over time. Local flair, local fare, and local fares. Tourism would likely increase overall, which is not necessarily a bad thing, provided that it is done within the relevant renewal rates of the relevant bioregions. Again, in virtue of having more free time available, and the resources available to do so more widely available. As repeatedly mentioned, the capacity for most bioregions in conjunction with their adjacent bioregions to produce a wide variety of foods and raw materials for production of worked goods and services entails that for the most part, there isn't going to be a meaningful loss of goods and services. So, relative loss of goods and services? Perhaps more like the loss of unwanted goods and services. When folks bemoan the potential and supposed loss of these kinds of things, they are failing to recognize that other goods and services are being provided, and likewise they are failing to recognize that the metric whereby those goods and services are lost stems from people themselves. If, that is, people choose not to labor in a given industry, we may very well hold that such constitutes a very good reason not to have said industry. Much as how in the current moneyed system, if people choose not to use their money on some good or service, that is a good reason to hold that that good or service is not desirable. Likewise, if folks can't give it away, that is, if the producers of a good or service can't even give it away, that may be a good reason to suppose that no one actually wants it, and hence that we ought not necessarily lament the loss, or the change in the goods and services provided. Although some of these points are covered elsewhere, specifically in the real benefits and the pragmatics of implementation sections, there are some things a bit more seriously worth considering within the real concerns section. In the currents of the reality we live in regarding most goods and services, it is very plausible that a radically small fraction of people really need to work to provide goods and services for basically everyone. This is, in other words, the industrial reality we live in. Many of the sections in this piece are pointing out flaws, limitations, etc., and providing alternatives to those flaws, limitations, etc., but they are largely predicated upon the current reality of industrialization and digitization. They wouldn't be as plausible, or perhaps as desirable a methodology of society sans mass industrialization and digitization. The essence of the current quandary is more or less as follows. There is a massive surplus of jobs currently, understood as jobs that labor doesn't really want even within the constraints of labor understanding themselves as the consumers. Partly this is due to much of the, shall we say, more meaningful kinds of labor, more pragmatic kinds of labor, being reduced in the overall amount of labor required to accomplish the tasks. If we remove all the surplus labor in the systems, all the BS jobs, scams, thievery, etc., which will largely be removed in a moneyless free labor society simply in virtue of its removal of money, we may very well end up with a system wherein something like 1 to 20% of the population is working outside the home to produce all the goods and services for the remaining population. The variation largely depends on exactly which industry we may be speaking of. For instance, It is likely less than 1% of the population that either can or does provide for literally all the furniture and housing construction needs for everyone. Whereas the percentage that creates and distributes all the food may be closer to the 20% mark, and so forth. The issue arises, therefore, as to if such is just. How to make it just? Supposing, in other words, that all the labor that produces all the goods and services the species would want produced outside the home is accomplished with 5% of the population globally. Just distribution of labors, firstly. We'd want that labor to be more evenly distributed between the various bioregions. Much of this piece provides guidance on how to do that. Call such a relevant point of justice regarding the bioregional restraints applied to trade in general. Joint carving and justice have a long and relevant history. Just distribution of labors, secondly. We would have to begin recognizing the in-home labor as real meaningful labor, be that the traditionally masculine or the traditionally feminine labor in the home. Making, raising, and educating kids, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the homes, etc., the more that is done in-home, the less those kinds of labors are done outside of the home. Hence all the incentives for labor to reaffirm such things as home ownership, less work hours outside the homes, etc., noting that these things work in tandem with each other. The fewer laborers outside the home that provide for all the required labor outside the home, the more time in the home labor can do its thing, the more in-home labor does its thing, the less labor outside the home is required. Hence the hands of labor doing their thing overall. The points therein being that such helps deal with perceptions of labor grievances, that is, views that pretend that this or that labor is greater or lesser, more or less deserving, etc. Understanding between all parties involved that by arranging these kinds of things thoughtfully via the metrics of the hands of labor, the overall workload for everyone involved is greatly lessened. Just distribution of labors, thirdly. We'd have to shift the labor burden outside the home from an emphasis on each laborer doing as much as possible, as efficiently as possible, to providing each laborer with the plausibility of working less hours outside the home. In other words, having a workforce that individually works less hours, by increasing the size of the workforce within the relevant industries. With everyone working for DOF, the concerns of paying the laborers as a methodology of reduction in costs, illusory money claims, is no longer an issue. Labor resentment and fair distribution of labor involved become the metrics of concern. So, a bit roughly but relevantly, if a given industry requires 1,000 workers in the current to provide the goods and services, double the workforce, half the work time by each individual, in order to spread out the workload as a whole. Noting again with the massive surpluses of labor currently in the system, we are not really going to be having anything like labor shortages as such in the mid and long term at any rate. Just distribution of labors, fourthly. Somewhat sadly to have to bring up, but despite there being any sex differences in capacities or differences in dispositions, all roles ought to be available to all peoples. That is, we may expect there to be some jobs, in-home or out of home, that disproportionately are done by one or the other sex. There may, in other words, be real biological differences of note, real dispositional differences of note, and real cultural differences of note, and yet none of that implies in any way that therefore all people of either sex ought to do the thing. To utilize the relevant philosophical point does not imply ought. Just because it is, or may be the case that there are sex differences, doesn't imply that we ought to enforce them. Again, kinda sad to have to be pointing this out, but the same applies to supposed racial, ethnic, etc. differences. Supposing, in other words, that this or that race, ethnicity, etc. has some kind of biological, cultural, etc. difference that is actually meaningfully applicable to some job, doesn't actually entail that that race, ethnicity, etc. ought to be relegated to that job. Nor that any other race, culture, ethnicity, etc. ought be excluded from that job. It may be the case that there are such differences. I honestly remain skeptical of that, but it is possible that there are. However, regardless, the point is that basic freedom to choose one's labor is critically important, and moreover, that any such dispositions/differences, if they exist, will make themselves manifest via a free labor system. If there are real dispositions/differences predicated on such things, people will therefore gravitate towards them. The point being though, shit don't fucking matter, y'all. And even if they are real, that doesn't imply an ought to enforcement. Folks interested in exploring these aspects are encouraged to see The Odd Questions of Privilege, a slight history of colonialism on the Amateur Philosophy YouTube channel or website. In essence, the applicable claim here is that such concerns are aesthetical ethical sorts of concerns, rather than obligatory sorts of ethical concerns. Similar can be said for class. Even if there are class distinctions of note, that doesn't imply any kind of ought disposition. Any given job, in other words, is open to any given class. Such actually has a fair amount of complication to it in practice, regarding education, learning of trades, and so forth. Much of this is dealt with elsewhere, however. Here note though the rather obvious point that absent money, many of the barriers involved that create class differences go away. Over time we might expect the class distinctions themselves to largely or completely go away, or at any rate, be dependent upon other metrics, like for instance, prestige. Understanding that what is being suggested here is not really that novel. A good and proper historian would recognize aspects of what's being proposed here within different cultures throughout history. The most relevant aspect, and one that is broadly common throughout most of the species' history, is that by and large most people spent their lives doing farm labor, in their homes, in small communities, etc., and things got along just fine. In other words, by and large the issues of economics, politics, and so forth were simply not the purview or interest of the overwhelming majority of people. The point isn't to suggest that we ought to go back to everyone being a farmer. The point is that much of what we are in the current assuming is indelibly a part of life simply isn't. And the point is that if we do utilize that bit of wisdom from history, wherein money was not an integral part of life, wherein homes and land were generally freely given, wherein the local goods and services of a society were generally freely offered to each other, in conjunction with the industrial reality that we currently live in, the modality of life for everyone will be very different and the quality of life for everyone can be radically improved. In some not entirely unrelated sense, folks may consider such akin to, but not exactly like, the obligatory services given to one's lord, ruler, etc., within a variety of societies throughout history, wherein that service was limited in this or that way. In the current we may note that such still happens in a variety of ways. In essence, something like, y'all free to do whatever, within some set of laws, but when it comes to certain communal interests, Y'all have gots to pony up the relevant labor. The proposal here is something similar, suggesting that the overwhelming majority of the species' needs can be met by ponying up on some of the essential labor in an equitable way, thereby largely leaving people to live their lives as they want, which primarily consists of the various in-home labors and local community blah blah blah. Taking the immediately preceding into consideration as methodologies for ameliorating the possible injustices, the main thrust for how to deal with the supposed injustice is via equitable distribution of the labors. Such in essence entails an obligatory workweek and number of years of work outside the home. Some of this is detailed elsewhere in the piece. In this section we merely note that such amounts to similar to what the species is generally currently doing and used to, the difference being that by an equitable distribution and reduction of surplus labors, the obligatory workweek and number of years of work outside the home are greatly lessened. After all, if only 5% of the population is theoretically required to do the industrial labors required to provide for the goods and services for everyone else, when that kind of labor is equitably distributed, we might expect the actual amount of work being placed on any individual, and the amount of years they are required to work will be far, far less than in the current. Understanding too that such actually entails an increase in the amount of in-home labors as noted here and in other sections, but that such labors are generally the sorts of labors the species actually enjoys doing. Delineation of scalar relevance. With the immediately preceding in mind, consider the sort of wisdoms associated with the delineation of any given industry to their scalar relevance, specifically as they relate to the bioregionally constrained structure. If people are obligated towards some degree of labors, it is fairly crucial to delimit the scope whereby any given grouping of people are doing their obligatory labor. Hence, cottage industries tending towards primarily providing for their bioregion and all adjacent bioregions. The notion therein being that for many, though not all, of industrial processes it would likely be inappropriate to have labor from non-adjacent bioregions being obligated to provide it. Granting again that some kinds of industrial processes are likely actually preferable to work this way as the resources being used are not evenly distributed, etc., and that for some kinds of precision industrial processes there is little rationale to have them be provided via cottage industries. Such entails a limit to growth of any given industry, at least in general. The determination of such has a few soft limits, that is, limits that are guiding but not necessarily absolutist in form. Primarily, the hands of labor provide a significant check on overworking and a significant impetus towards en masse industrial production. These kinds of natural processes of freely chosen labor functionally operate like the supposed invisible hand of the market. The hands of labor work within the constraints of bioregionally scalar relevance of labor for a variety of pragmatic reasons, alluded to throughout this piece. In this section the notion rather bluntly is to act as a check on the possibility of an industry growing too large, specifically, an industry trying to provide for non-adjacent bioregions other than tertiarily, and perhaps providing for adjacent bioregions primarily, though again, adjacent bioregions relationships are far more intimate in their structures. Both of these kinds of limits are soft, in that the former depends upon freely chosen labor, the latter expressly allows for gift-giving beyond the constraints they outline. Flipping the horror. The concern can be raised regarding the pragmatics of the distribution of goods and services, specifically, simply how. How could the goods and services be distributed efficiently and fairly within a moneyless free labor society? To reiterate the relevant metrics, in the current the notion is that money in essence acts as a tool to distribute the goods and services by providing an impetus to produce and distribute this or that good or service. In a moneyless free labor society, the impetus is more multifaceted. In terms of access to the goods and services, the impetus to produce and distribute this or that good or service is to thereby gain access to all goods and services available within a given set of adjacent bioregions. Additional impetuses to do so are such things as kindness, boredom, generosity, education on the benefits of doing so, a sense of duty to self, family, community and others more generally, potentially simple work quotas, and the rationales for doing so such as presented here. The argument that by not utilizing the tool of money the species does better. In terms of the relevant information, the claim again is that the tool of money provides data as to what the various needs, wants, and desires are, though such data is distorted via exactly the tool of money. The data that has been acquired in the current regarding what are and how to supply the various needs, wants, and desires of people are all known quantities, and hence in every meaningful sense we do not need the tool of money to determine such things. Such is sufficient answer to the initial concerns regarding the distribution of goods and services, in that it answers the questions of impetus to do so, and the basic data requirements that can be utilized to actualize the distribution. Still, there remain some pragmatic concerns regarding such things as how the goods and services are distributed in the sense of venues and means of access. Rephrasing the initial concern, how might folks expect goods and services to be distributed within a moneyless free labor society, wherein there isn't a from-on-high command, given the various industrial and digital capacities at the species' disposal, and given the data and impetuses utilized? This concern has largely been addressed elsewhere within this piece. In summary, the open gift-giving market, utilization of online platforms, a bit less tetchy, basic communication towards cooperation rather than competition, tendency for labor to prefer less work outside the home. Hence a tendency to prefer to do industrial production work, tendency for labor to prefer in-home work. Hence a tendency towards greater hobbies, crafts, arts, etc. A tendency of the entrepreneur to create local distribution, hence cottage industries, and idiosyncratic production/distribution. The consideration is that each set of adjacent bioregions has their own regional distribution centers, the basic models that arose via industrialization, globalization, and the online market platforms. In regards to the open gift-giving market, online platforms, the basic modeling whereby individual brick-and-mortar shops can have their wares centrally located in an accessible manner to essentially everyone is desirable. This runs counter to the disposition of overly centralized distribution centers in the current online platforms. The notion therein having to do with a preference and pragmatic regarding various labors, such as having meaningful work, quality living spaces, availability of variety, and the various pragmatic limits regarding trading as it relates to bioregional sustainability. Absent the metrics of money, concerns of quality and idiosyncratic interests come to the fore. In the current, origin point of the good or service doesn't really matter. However, The relevant algorithms can direct users to their most locally sourced materials without too much difficulty involved. Organizing all online storefronts predicated upon their relevant set of adjacent bioregions may be sufficient, but the lack of nuance to it would be a significant inefficiency in the system, especially in a moneyless free labor society. Such would mask the costs associated with distribution of the goods and services. Simply having the users directed to the most locally available source, therefore, is more preferable an option than supposing that the users ought to shop around within the relevant set of adjacent bioregions. Doing so also provides users with the capacity to understand what may be lacking within their more local community. If folks are searching for shoes and cannot find a local source for shoes, such entails that there is a lacking of a shoe producer within their relevant locale. Such presents itself as a relevant entrepreneurial opportunity. Noting, however, that when it comes to many industrially produced items, only a small number of cottage factories are actually required to meet the industrial needs, wants, and desires. That said, if there are no idiosyncratic producers of the items, the non-industrial producers of such things within a more local, small-town community, such does inform people that that kind of labor is something that, if not outright needed, is something that likely would be wanted and desired within the community. It is fairly easy to imagine that such a systemization could be utilized to provide information to the consumers, laborers, and producers more generally to tailor their production and consumption habits towards a more harmonious disposition within a given locale. The metrics therein being freedom of choice of labor, accurate information regarding the needs, wants, and desires, and the freedoms of capacity to produce. All within certain reasonable constraints. In other words, bioregionally bound, and working within the relevant renewal rates of the relevant resources. As it relates to the less worked materials, the raw materials whereby worked goods and services are provided. There are no obvious or indeed unobvious reasons as to why such producers couldn't also simply place their available supplies upon a parallel-styled open gift-giving exchange. Doing so enables not only the cottage industries to more seamlessly structure their organization as local as possible, but it also enables the various entrepreneurs to access the relevant resources for their work. Such potentially enables the more rapid development of cottage industries, as much of the legwork of doing so is eliminated. Such likewise can indicate to the relevant industrialists which cottage industries ought to be constructed. That is, by having it plainly placed as to what raw materials are available within a given set of bioregions, the industrialists can better determine which cottage industries are plausible. Likewise, such can indicate what kinds of raw materials ought to be grown, raised, etc., assuming that such is plausible within the set of adjacent bioregions. Understanding that tertiary trade is a thing, again the imperative is as local as possible. Limit tertiary trade to that which is necessary to meet the needs, wants, and desires. As it relates to existing industries of worked goods and services within a given set of adjacent bioregions, they can be listed, enabling them to connect with the producers of the raw materials more efficiently. Doing so also better informs the entrepreneurs as to what is currently already being produced within the set of adjacent bioregions, where they are located, enabling them to make better decisions as to what additional cottage industries ought to be constructed. Doing so avoids potentially wasteful endeavors and more soundly constructs the relevant distribution of goods and services. The entrepreneurs can place in essence order requests signaling intent towards some particular kind of endeavor. In principle, doing so may enable the intent to be matched with the relevant resources as locally sourced as possible. Although there is certainly plausibly some degree of variability involved, when speaking of most such endeavors, the required resources, labor requirements, etc., are largely known quantities. Which is to say that such information needn't necessarily be figured out by the entrepreneur. The aim, after all, isn't competition but cooperative effort, hence there are no real incentives to keep that information opaque. As it relates to labor, online platforms provide the capacity for laborers to connect to the various jobs within a given set of bioregions. Likewise, the venue offers the entrepreneur the capacity to put together the relevant people required for the endeavor. There isn't necessarily a whole lot changed from the existing models, though the plethora of different platforms is somewhat superfluous. It is likely more efficient to simply have one platform per set of adjacent bioregions. It is plausibly better to do so as the platform can better focus on the various needs, wants, and desires of a specific set of bioregions. This skews from the existing model wherein labor is sought after essentially from anywhere in the world. It wouldn't be the case that folks can't seek after labor or jobs beyond a given set of bioregions. Far more so, it incentivizes hiring from within a community. Constraining the pool of labor thusly better ensures that the folks within a given community are contributing to their community. Such also avoids the issues associated with poaching, fighting over labor, etc. It is important to recognize within that the incentives for labor to move are greatly lessened within a moneyless free labor society. There isn't a money incentive to move to this or that location. Incentives to move have more to do with preferences of where to live, and potentially interests in doing some particular kind of labor that isn't available within their immediate community. Hence, on a pragmatic level, the capacity to hire someone is likely to diminish the further away one is trying to hire. In the current, this tendency is significantly tempered by the reality of online commuting, insofar as such is plausible for a job, of course. By restraining hiring thusly, we might also expect more soundly locally structured economies. Where economies here are understood as being comprised of meaningful productive labor, plethora of options available for doing so, access to the goods and services thereby provided, rather than any sort of measurement of moneyed activity as such. Doing so likewise better enables the laborers to understand what kinds of work are available, and provides them with the possibility that they may turn entrepreneurial. If the kind of labor they prefer isn't available locally, they may decide to simply do so themselves. The entrepreneur can utilize such platforms to put together the relevant laborers, to actualize whatever it is they are attempting to actualize. In regards to industrially produced goods and services, cottage industries online. Insofar as these are producing and distributing goods and services, the basic online shopping model in place is largely applicable. Directing consumers of such goods and services to the most locally available option, whereby the goods and services are delivered, rather than the consumer going to the place themselves. The basic rationale regards pragmatics of industries. Their centralization entails more than merely inconvenience on the part of consumers to access them. It presents an impracticality of doing so. Lacking any particular price incentive to select the industrially produced goods or services, there remains a significant convenience incentive, which is not entirely undesirable. Again, the laborer prefers less labor, and industrially produced goods and services overall take less labor. What we might expect to diminish thereby are storefronts that are simply representing the exact same goods and services that are being industrially produced. Which, IMHO isn't really a loss in any meaningful sense of that term. Call such, again, the reduction of surplus labor. It is possible that at least in regards to some kinds of industrially produced goods and services that individuals can request made-to-order products. Such relates rather strongly to the capacity of a cottage industry to easily retool the mechanics involved in production. Such is likely a desirable sort of thing, in that overall it reduces labor and increases individual options. The reduction in labor stemming from having what may otherwise have been multiple industrial factories being centralized into one facility that retools, while at the same time increasing the available options for the consumers. Such improves distribution via the same metric. The centralized location of multiple kinds of produced items entails a distribution of those items along a similarly centralized distribution network. Having, for instance, one truck distribute multiple kinds of industrially produced items, rather than separate trucks each dedicated to distributing one kind of item. Idiosyncratic labor, smaller shops, and individual producers online. In either case, having access to the relevant raw and less worked goods and services in a similar manner as cottage industries enables such folk to do the relevant labors involved. The incentives for doing so are idiosyncratic on the part of the folks that choose to do such labor. In terms of the cottage industries and larger-scale industries, their incentives to provide those sorts of materials remains that overall it reduces industrial labor and increases their access to local, idiosyncratic goods and services. The overall reduction in industrial labor occurs as it relates to the production of more worked goods and services. From the perspective of those providing the lesser worked/raw goods and services, there is no net change in production. If, that is, the smaller shop producer or the individual chooses to do that labor, whereby doing so is supplying a particular demand, it makes little difference from their perspective who is crafting the more worked goods or service. If by doing so the small shop is not effectively supplying a demand, it would constitute more labor as it would be supplying for a superfluous good or service. Such smaller shops would take a form not as merely retail, but on-site, handcrafted production and distribution. In the case of the individual, however, they are inherently supplying a demand, hence a reduction in labor overall. In making it themselves, they thereby supply a demand. Understanding, again, that by reduction in labor, we are referring to reduction in labor that is unwanted, unneeded, and/or undesirable. The metric of such being, again, exactly the hands of labor, freely chosen. The other aspect of reduction in labor being the tendency to prefer industrial processes, as such produces goods and services far and away with less labor overall. Again, the notion therein being that insofar as labor is choosing to do labor that is more laborious, not industrialized, such is a freely chosen good. There are, however, meaningful differences in terms of how smaller shops and individuals can realistically and pragmatically be supplied. Specifically, cottage industries and industrial suppliers tend to supply en masse. Such entails the local distributor, the local hardware store, supply shop, etc., which can handle receiving a reasonable amount of materials from the more raw/less worked suppliers. In regards to idiosyncratic labors, the smaller providers of goods and services. As the immediately preceding subsection noted, such folks primarily deal with local distributors, where local is also idiosyncratic and hence not really bioregionally defined, as in town shops, store fronts, etc. In the Moneyless Free Labor Society, folks ought expect that such places provide specialized, more worked and refined goods and services. The notion of a retail store that sells pretty much the exact same thing as one can find online via some cottage industrial provider, after all, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Such places also would tend to supply idiosyncratically available goods and services, that is, goods and services that are available specifically in virtue of the area. Perhaps more to the point, such goods and services that are not really possible to be provided online, or which are better suited to not being provided online. In broad strokes, among the kinds of places folks might expect to not exist are franchised providers of those kinds of goods and services, non-industrially produced goods and services. Absent any moneyed incentive, there isn't any motivation on the part of folks outside a given idiosyncratic location to necessarily provide such goods or services. What, after all, would be the motivation of a corporation to infiltrate the market? They do not live there, they have no skin in the game, they aren't going to be making money from it, and there isn't even really an incentive to provide jobs per se. There are incentives for locals to provide those kinds of goods and services. They themselves are largely the ones partaking in exactly those goods and services. This point requires some explanation as to how such may likely develop. In particular, we are referring to those kinds of businesses that utilize space within any given locale. A hotel, a clothing shop, a restaurant/eatery, a salon, barber shop, spa, etc. There is a delineation here between a company that supplies goods or services non-locally and the franchise which tends to displace local businesses, literally occupying a spatial location within each locale that it operates. Likely best exemplified via the notion of the cottage industry. The cottage industry isn't located within each and every locale that it supplies. Another good indicator regards the decision-making of the place. If the decisions are not made by local people, there's a good chance it's a franchise, or more generically put to the point, there's a good chance that kind of business simply wouldn't exist in a moneyless free labor society. In sum, and in broad strokes, the kinds of businesses that would exist within any given locale are those that take up physical space to run, those that are tasked with distributing industrially produced goods and services, and those whereby the decisions are made to its operation by local people. In most of these cases, it isn't that the kinds of goods and services such businesses provide wouldn't thereby be provided. It is far more that who is providing them and their motivations for doing so shifts. Again, this is not something that would necessarily be determined from on high dictum, rather such is as consequent of a moneyless free labor society. As an aside, a midway fisher's finisher, I feel like a fabulous way to frame the relevant figures on the matters of economics and human societies more generally, is as what sorts of systems, cultural norms, legal realities, etc., are in place as foundations. Then let it ride. A system that requires more and repetitious interventions to make it function is indicative of faulty foundations. A valid and sound foundation functions well as font for human flourishing on its own merits. That which derives from a moneyless free labor society is that which is actually of human flourishing. Flourishing doesn't fall out of the system, rather, flourishing is the generative functional form.
Unachosema,